Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be, and welcome to a science post on the ozone layer. It's called Ozone Bozos. It's a subject that surprised me when I started to look into it and revisit the things that I learned in a classroom 20 years ago. It's amazing to see how the stories we tell can change so quickly. When I saw a recent lecture from a retired MIT professor of atmospheric science, it's posted in the blog post below on YouTube, I saw someone who had witnessed what had happened to his specialty when its funding increased 18-fold in the 1990s. What he saw was a scientific community that could not responsibly absorb the influx of money and people. Geologists who didn't know much about atmospheric science had suddenly rebranded themselves as atmospheric scientists so that they could absorb some of the funding influx. And the results of this were nothing short of catastrophic. These newcomers to their field knew how to write grant applications and provide the sort of narrative and research that the politicians with money wanted to hear. They were also able to train a generation of young people who would come to think of themselves as climate scientists. Meanwhile, those who had the most solid grounding in the discipline of atmospheric science found themselves completely outnumbered by these newcomers. The true experts looked back further than 100 years of climate history and understood that the newcomers were suffering from serious myopia and a bad case of faith in unproven, non-benchmarked computer simulations. But the real experts' voices were drowned out by a flood of youthful enthusiasm and a desire to save the world with science. This went on throughout the 1990s and the 2000s, at which point the politicians started using the research of these newcomers to promote their goal of remaking governments and economies around a system of carbon credits rather than money. What a great way to create centralized global control and increase people's faith in government labs with access to supercomputers that can do AI-assisted fortune telling about the future. Who doesn't love it when technocrats take over the world? Philosopher kings chosen by corporate oligarchs would rule the world, and there would be peace and prosperity for all. Are we really ready for that? Are our technocrats that smart? This wonderful plan would only work if voters and consumers were sufficiently terrified that the world was coming to an end and sufficiently overwhelmed by their responsibilities that they never get a chance to think about these issues deeply. Judging by what I see on the media today, these thought leaders have done a pretty good job of scaring people and at convincing people that they have caused the destruction of the world through their spendthrift ways. You too can be a good person and a smart believer in science if you trust in anthropogenic climate change. This is the message that everyone has been encouraged to absorb, and I did. I was part of that demographic, and I saw the same shows, and I believed this. Made perfect sense. I am a wasteful person. I must atone for my sins. The audacity of this henny penny-esque scheme might convince many people that it is impossible, yet it has worked before. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I remember sitting in a chemistry class and listening to a lecture on how CFCs, or chlorofluorocarbons, interact with ozone molecules in the atmosphere to cause a chain reaction effect. A single CFC molecule was like a wrecking ball for the ozone layer, protecting us from UV light that will give us all cancer. The lecture I saw in college 20 years ago was delivered with passion by a professor who was known to have said that he was never going to have kids because he didn't want to contribute to the destruction of the planet. This made sense to me at the time, since I also harbored a significant amount of misanthropic self-hatred in those years. I grew up watching a cartoon called Captain Planet. And if I'm lucky, it will play.
Earth, wind, water, heart, go planet! By your powers combined, I am Captain Planet. Captain Planet, he's our hero. Gonna take pollution down to zero. He's our powers magnified, and he's fighting on the planet side.
Yeah, I'm gonna be a hero when I grow up. I'm gonna save the planet. I remember this chemistry professor explaining that there were natural cyclical changes in the ozone layer above the poles of the planet, and that it would disappear when there was no sunlight and reappear when the sunlight came back. He, however, emphasized that the changes wrought by chlorofluorocarbons, or freon, molecules exacerbated these natural cyclical fluctuations to a disastrous degree. I believed him. Why shouldn't I have? I'm the student. He was the chemistry professor, and I'd been trained to believe that humans are destroying the planet. Only we could save it through heroic scientific action. Now, I should pause here. I know that we are destroying many parts of the planet. There are absolute toxic waste dumps all over the place. But it's important to remember the scale of our planet. And while I think these targeted polluters need to be brought to account and made to pay to clean up these horrible, horrible disasters, I am very concerned when we expand from these small-scale toxic waste dumps and then we blow it up and say that the entire planet is a toxic waste dump. This extrapolation, it makes us vulnerable to being manipulated and making us afraid and trying to change our behaviors in ways that I think are demonstrably dishonest. So I grew up thinking that, being conditioned to believe that if I studied hard, I could someday be a scientific hero too. I, of course, was so busy trying to pass my classes that I didn't really have any time to think about what might happen if everyone thought in that way. What does happen when everyone wants to be a scientific hero? All I knew was that a Nobel Prize was given to the heroes Molina, Cruzen et al. For their alarming research on chlorofluorocarbons and ozone. I didn't know that their theory was later proven to be wrong by a factor of 10, and this was probably the theory that my chemistry professor was lecturing us about. It did seem quite frightening at the time. The story that nitric acid clouds in the southern hemisphere polar vortex accelerated the liberation of chlorine gas. That was the story. These clouds also removed nitric acid that reacts with chlorine, adding to a buildup of chlorine gas during the winter. When the sun comes up, it rapidly dissociates the chlorine gas from Cl2 to Cl atoms, chlorine atoms, which catalyzed ozone destruction in the Antarctic spring. These conditions only occasionally occur in the northern hemisphere, and if I had had the chance to really think about what was going on, I would have wondered why this disastrous ozone hole was only occurring over the Antarctic and not over the Arctic. Only decades later, now, did I learn that not only are there daily and yearly cycles in the polar ozone, there are also longer-term cycles due to solar cycles and the magnetic field nutation and wobble of the Earth on its axis. Volcanic eruptions have huge temporary effects on ozone concentration, and that is probably what scientists were measuring and reacting to, but they didn't know it. And the total amount of freon or chlorofluorocarbons produced by humans pales in comparison to the CFCs or chlorofluorocarbons produced by the Erebus volcano in Antarctica. I didn't know about this volcano when I learned the story of how we were destroying the planet. Suddenly, the simplified story my professor had told me didn't look so bulletproof. In hindsight, it took decades before curious individuals managed to put all of these pieces together and figure out that the real cause of the change in the ozone concentration that scared politicians into banning chlorofluorocarbons was a gigantic volcano. It had nothing to do with freon. The story develops another dimension when one learns that DuPont's patent on the chlorofluorocarbon manufacturing process was set to expire in 1979, and DuPont formed a lobbying group called the Alliance for Responsible CFC Policy that pushed for the banning of CFCs. Coincidentally, DuPont's new HCFCs, a new molecule they'd patented in 1986, it wouldn't harm the ozone layer. I mean, that's pretty low down. Several books and blogs have been written about this, but strangely enough, I haven't seen any of them make the front page of any newspapers or news magazines. I have a quote from a book by Tony Heller, The Ozone Hole Scam. He writes, "The first problem is that the ozone hole never extends beyond Antarctica and only appears in the winter, when there isn't any sunlight. ozone is created in the upper atmosphere by sunlight. You can't get skin cancer from sunlight during times when the sun isn't shining. As soon as the sun comes back out over Antarctica, the ozone hole disappears. So how are people in Australia going to get skin cancer from an ozone hole thousands of miles away during winter when the sun is low in the sky? The second problem is that the ozone hole size varies tremendously from year to year, despite relatively stable, steady levels of CFCs in the atmosphere. It is quite clear that CFCs are not the controlling factor. And after I read this, it was disturbing because it was in direct contradiction to what I learned in my chemistry class. It was literally in my Chemistry 101 class that this was taught to me, that the danger of the ozone hole was introduced to me. So I looked for the other side of the story to see how that's changed over the years, and I'll read that to you right now. Your common sense attitude unfortunately neglects some very important effects, including the observational facts. Observations show that tropical air has less ozone than polar air due to a wave-driven circulation called the Brewer-Dobson circulation. This transports ozone-rich air from the tropics into the subtropics and polar regions. Another point is that the ozone does not disappear when the UV source is gone. This is because the steady state of ozone is a balance between production and loss. Both the production and loss are driven by UV. The UV dissociation of O2 to two oxygen atoms at a wavelength less than 250 nanometers allows the oxygen to recombine with ozone to make oxygen. Additionally, ozone is itself dissociated at wavelengths between 250 and 300 nanometers. Shut off the UV and you shut off the loss process at the same time you stop the production. However, that means that the ozone you have stays relatively constant throughout the winter. This is verified by satellite, ground-based, and balloon observations in the polar regions that show while reaching a peak of about 350 DU at midsummer, it falls to about 250 DU a month later and maintains that level until sunrise in the autumn. Sunrise generally produces a drop in the ozone due to the surprise at wavelengths that dissociate ozone occurring before those that produce ozone. But this drop has gone from 225 DU in 1977 to about 100 DU due to the added catalytic loss of reactions with chlorine liberated from CFC. Finally, CFC are man-made compounds that do not occur naturally. Yes, chlorine, carbon, and fluorine occur naturally, but they do not form the complex molecular structure of CFC. While naturally occurring sources do produce some small amounts of chlorine at stratospheric heights, the release from UV dissociation of CFC molecules in the stratosphere is the largest source. Complexity. Not everyone can see through a gish gallop, and students are the least well equipped to understand when they are being fed such a form of misdirection. So, if I try to shorten a long story, I know that atmospheric chemist F. Sherwood Rowland of the University of California, Irvine, formulated the theory of ozone in the upper atmosphere and in the 1970s, and his speculations gained so much momentum that by the 1980s, his speculations were believed to be fact, despite not very many measurements, and politicians were convinced to ban the production of a popular coolant, Freon, or CFCs. And this benefited DuPont, the company that had taken out a patent on the chemical that would compete with Freon. Today, the same story is repeating on a larger scale. Only this time, politicians have been convinced to force people to regulate their production of carbon dioxide. Instead of DuPont trying to preserve profit margins, this time the story is driven by fear of something called peak oil and peak phosphate. I have a link to that article in the blog post below. And the trouble is that this fear is legitimate. The idea that there is a limit to easy energy extraction, and that this has extreme consequences for our world. But it seems that some genius in some think tank must have decided that it would be easier to make people afraid of the weather than of an economic crisis or an energy crisis. And it seems this plan, it's worked very well because everyone's convinced that we are the cause of our climate change, without knowing that the climate changes in expected ways, and that the changes we're seeing right now are not particularly unexpected, and that they're not caused by fossil fuels. Although I can't stop being annoyed by feeling duped. I hate that. And I mean, the people who engineered this plan, I'm sure they have control over the media, so they don't have to worry about how annoyed people would get when they learn that they've been duped by their government experts. It's possible that there will still be backlash over this as people just lose faith entirely in government-funded science, and that this was a planned sacrifice, that they built a house of cards just to tear it down. I mean, I think that when people understand this in a few years, it will bring down the entire publicly funded science sector. Then again, maybe that is all part of the plan. Heroes are often lifted up only to be torn down, and our present-day scientific heroes have been guilty of a lot of nonsense. And I have some links to all of these government-funded science nonsense that I found, and this sort of nonsense is a natural result when an industry is flooded with more funding than it can responsibly absorb. I am not happy with how I was led, blindfolded, into a career based on nonsense, and how my children are being terrified by nonsense climate propaganda. I mean, it has real psychological effects on people that are not... I mean, it's an unintended consequence of trying to make people afraid all the time. They work harder. If I work hard enough, I'll be good enough and I'll survive. It's so sad. I mean, people could be happier. And in order to feel happy, I sing songs. And let's see what song I can sing right now. I want to sing a Beatles song. I don't know if I can do this. I've never done this one. Here come old Flat Top, he come grooving up slowly. He got juju eyeballs, he one holy roller. He got hair down to his knee. He got to be a joker, he just do what he please. Boom, boom, ba-da-dum. Boom, boom, ba-da-dum. He wear no shoe shine, he got Joe Jam football, he got monkey finger, he shoot Coca-Cola, he say, I know you, and you know me. One thing I can tell you is you got to be free. Come together right now over me. Boom, boom, ba-da-dum. Boom, boom, ba-da-dum. He a bad production, he got walrus gumboot, he got oh no sidebar, but he won spinal cracker, he got feet down below his knee. Hold you in his armchair, you can feel his disease. Come together right now over me. He roller coaster, he got early warning, he got muddy water, he won mojo filter, he say 1 and 1 and 1 is 3. Got to be good looking 'cause he's so hard to see. Come together right now over me. Boom, boom, ba-da-dum. Boom, boom, ba-da-dum. Come together. Come together. If you don't like singing, I encourage you to read some fun books. And I wrote a book that I think is pretty fun, and I hope you check it out. It's a bit satirical. It's about the limits of the scientific method. And I thank you for watching and hope you tune in next time for the next video.